Chapter 27. They left Dover just after 11 o'clock, by which time Miss Marlowe had quarrelled with both her escorts. Emerging from her bedchamber in the guise of a haughty young lady of fashion, she encountered Tom, and instantly asked him whether he had recovered the money he had left in his portmanteau. Upon being reassured on this point, she asked him if he would hire a chaise for their conveyance to London. "No," said Tom, never once to mince his words. "I've got a better use for my blunt." "I will repay you, I promise you," she urged. "Much obliged. When?" said Tom brutally. "Grandmamma, mighty pure security." "No, I thank you." "If she will not do it, I'll sell my pearls," she declared. "That would make me cut a fine figure, wouldn't it?" "Tom, I don't wish to travel at Selford's expense," she blurted out. "That's easily settled. Sell your pearls and pay him," she said stiffly. "If you won't do what I particularly wish, will you at least request the Duke to tell you how much money he has expended on my behalf since we left Abbeville?" "When I make a cake of myself, it will be on my own account, and not on yours, Miss Woollycrown," said Tom. 2 vehicles had been provided for the journey. One was a hired post-chaise, the other Sylvester's own phaeton, and to each was harnessed a team of 4 horses. They were job horses, but they had been chosen by Cayley, and therefore, as Master Rain pointed out to his uncle, prime cattle. When Tom brought his haughty charge out of the inn, he found Master Rain seated already at the phaeton, and Sylvester standing beside it, drawing out on his gloves. He went up to him, exclaiming, "Are you driving yourself all the way to London, Salford?" "I am," replied Sylvester. "I would offer to take you with me, but I am afraid Cayley must have that seat." "Yes, of course, but you don't mean to take Edmund too, do you? Had you not better let him come with us in the chaise?" "My dear Thomas, my only reason for telling Cayley to bring my phaeton to Dover was to save that brat as much travel sickness as I could. He is invariably sick in closed carriages and never in open ones. Will you accompany Miss Marlowe? I hope she will not find the journey too fatiguing. We are a little late in starting, but we should reach town in time for dinner." Tom, though strongly of the opinion that Sylvester, in his present humour, would be happy to part with his nephew on any terms at the end of the first stage, raised no further demur, but went back to hand Phoebe up into the chaise. For the first 5 miles not a word was uttered within this vehicle. But at Liddon, Phoebe, recovering a trifle, in her faithful friend's opinion, from the sullens, asked Tom where he meant to put up in London. "At Salford's house. He has invited me to spend a few days there, as long as I choose, in fact." "Oh, good gracious," said Phoebe. "What an honour for you! No wonder you are so unwilling to oblige me. I must be quite beneath your touch." "You'll precious soon wish you were beneath my touch, if you don't take care, my girl," said Tom. "If you've got any more pretty morsels of wit under your tongue, reserve 'em for Salford. He's far too well bred to give you your deserts. I ain't." Silence reigned for the next mile. "Tom," said Phoebe, in a small voice. "Well?" "I didn't mean to say that. It was a horrid thing to say. I beg your pardon." He took her hand and gave it a squeeze. "Pea-goose, what's the matter?" He waited for a moment. "I know I walked smash into a turn-up between you and Salford. What are you trying to do? Break your own silly neck?" She withdrew her hand. "Excuse me, Tom, if you please. It would be quite improper in me to repeat what passed between us. Pray say no more." "Very well," said Tom, "but don't you choke yourself up with pride, Phoebe." At Sittingbourne a halt was called, and the travellers partook of refreshment at the Rose. When they came out of the inn again, and Tom was about to hand Phoebe into the chaise, Sylvester said, "Do you care to tool the phaeton for a stage or two, Thomas?" "Oh, by Jove, yes, if you think I shan't overturn it," Tom replied with a rueful grin. "And if—" he hesitated, glancing at Phoebe. "Do just as you wish," she replied at once. "I can very well finish the journey in one of the accommodation coaches." Sylvester turned and strode towards the phaeton. "Get in," said Tom curtly. He added, as he took his seat beside Phoebe, "That's the first time I've been glad you are not my sister." She returned no answer. Scarcely half a dozen sentences were exchanged during the remainder of the journey, but although Phoebe pretended to be asleep for the greater part of the way, sleep was never farther from her. So torn was she by conflicting emotions. Beside her, Tom sat gazing out of the window, wondering what Sylvester could have said to have made her so angry, and wishing that there was something he could do for Sylvester, even if it were no more than relieving him of Edmund's company. But Cayley was shielding Sylvester from Edmund. "Give over plaguing his grace, Master Edmund," said Cayley. "Now that's quite enough, Master Edmund. There's no good to be got out of flying into one of your tantrums," said Cayley, thinking what a pity it was that he could no longer say the same to Sylvester. It was after 6 when the carriage drew up in Berkeley Square, before Salford House. "Why do we stop here?" demanded Phoebe. "To set down my portmanteau, of course," replied Tom, opening the chaise door. "Also, I dare say, to allow Salford to take leave of you. Try for a little civility." He climbed down from the chaise as he spoke. The doors of the great house were already flung open, and several persons emerged. "Reese, Reese, I've been to France," shouted Edmund, dashing up the steps. "Where's Button? She'll be astonished when she hears the things I've done. Oh, Button, I have needed you. Did you miss me, Button? Phoebe doesn't do the things the right way. Do you know, I had to tell her, Button." "Repellent brat," remarked Sylvester. "Reese, Mr. Ord is staying with me for a few days. Take care of him for me." "Will you go in with him, Thomas? I'll escort Miss Marlowe to Green Street." This scheme seemed so fraught with disaster that Tom could not help saying in an urgent undervoice, "I wouldn't, Salford. Leave her to come about." "Go in with Reese, Thomas. I shall be with you presently," replied Sylvester, as though he had not heard this advice. "Whew, tough." He mounted into the chaise, and almost before the door was shut, grasped Phoebe's hands, saying, "Phoebe, you must listen to me. I know I made wretched work of it. I can't explain it to you now. There is too little time, but I won't let you go like this. You can't think I would ask you to marry me in jest or to insult you." "You have told me already that you never meant to ask me," she replied, trying to pull her hands away. "I fancy you'll be truly thankful when you have recovered from the mortification of having your suit rejected, and that I didn't snap at so brilliant an offer. Will you please to release me, my Lord Duke?" "But I love you," he said, gripping her hands rather more tightly. "You are very obliging, but I cannot return your affection, sir." "I'll make you," he promised. "Oh, no, you will not," returned Phoebe, thoroughly ruffled. "Will you let me go? I have had no more conduct than to behave. If you have no more conduct than to behave in this fashion in the middle of the street, I have. Make me love you indeed. If I were not so angry, I could laugh to think how exactly I hit him off when I wrote of Ugolino that, try as he might to appear conciliating, he could not open his lips without betraying his arrogance." "Do you call it arrogance when I tell you that I love you and wish to make you my wife?" he demanded. "Yes, and folly too. You have never suffered a rebuff, have you, Duke? When any female has shown herself not to be disposed to like you, it has been a sport with you to make her like you, very much too well, I dare say, for her comfort. You even lay bets that where others have failed, you will succeed." "What nonsense is this?" he exclaimed. "I?" "Yes, you. Was there not an heiress who was called the Citadel? Or are your conquests too numerous to be remembered by you?" "I remember," he said grimly. "You had that from Irons, did you? Did she also tell you that it was a piece of funning between my brother and me, discreditable if you like, but never meant to go beyond the pair of us? In fact, you didn't storm the Citadel, Duke? For God's sake, Phoebe, must you throw in my face the foil's follies I committed when I was a boy? I would if you had outgrown that conceit, but you haven't. Why did you make yourself so agreeable to me? You must have had a great deal of practice, I think, for you did it beautifully. If I had not known what your object was, I am sure you must have succeeded in it, but I did know. Tom told you that I ran from Osterby because the thought of becoming your wife was repugnant to me, and you were so piked that you determined I should fall in love with you, and afterwards be sorry." He had so entirely forgotten that pettish resolve that he was thunderstruck. "Well," said Phoebe, watching him, can you deny it, Duke?" He released her hands at last, and uttered his crowning blunder. "No, I was piked. I did, in a fit of conceit, arrogance, anything you please to call it, form some such contemptible scheme. I beg you to believe it was of a very short duration." "I don't believe it," declared Phoebe. The chaise turned into Green Street. Miss Marlowe, having discharged much of the wrath she had been obliged to keep bottled up for so many painful hours, had begun to feel very low. The creature beside her, not content with humiliating her in public, and regarding all the disagreeable experiences she had undergone on his behalf with indifference and ingratitude, had stormed at her and insulted her, and now, when any but a monster of cold-hearted self-consequence must have known how tired and miserable she was, and how desperately in need of reassurance, he sat silent. Perhaps he needed encouragement. She gave it to him. "Having become acquainted with your other flames, Duke, all diamonds of the first water, I should have to be uncommonly green to believe that you preferred me. You asked me to marry you because you are so determined not to be obliged to own yourself worsted that you will go to any lengths to achieve your object." Now or never was the time for Sylvester to retrieve his character. He said very levelly, "You need say no more, Miss Marlowe. It would be useless, I realize, for me to attempt to answer you." If you wish to know what I think of you," said Phoebe in a shaking voice, "it is It is that you are a great deal worse than Count Ugolino." He was silent. Well, now she knew how right she had been. He was not in the least in love with her, and very happy she was to know it. All she wanted was a suitable retreat, such as a lumber room or a coal cellar, in which to enjoy her happiness to the full. The chaise drew to a standstill, and Sylvester got out, and with his own hands let down the steps. Such condescension! Pulling herself together, Phoebe alighted and said with great dignity, "I must thank you, Duke, for having been so kind as to have brought me back to England. In case we should not meet again, I should like, before we say good-bye, to assure you that I am not unmindful of what I owe you, and that I wish you extremely happy." This very beautiful speech might just as well have remained unspoken for all the heed he paid to it. He said, "I am coming in with you," and sounded the knocker. "I beg you most earnestly not to do so," she said with passionate sincerity. He took her hand in his. "Miss Marlowe, let me do this one thing for you. I know Lady Ingham and what her temper is. I promise you she shall not be angry with you, if only I may see her first." "You are very good, Duke, but I assure you I need no intervention," she said proudly. The door opened. Horwich ejaculated, "Miss Phoebe!" He then encountered a most unnerving stare from Sylvester, and bowed and stammered, "Your Grace." "Have Miss Marlowe's baggage carried into the house," said Sylvester coldly, and turned again to Phoebe. It was clearly useless to persist in argument, so, knowing that Horwich was listening to every word he said, he held out his hand and said, "I will leave you now, Miss Marlowe. I can never be sufficiently grateful to you for what you have done. Will you present my compliments to Lady Ingham, and inform her that I hope to call upon her shortly, when I shall tell her, for I know very well that you will not, how deeply indebted to you I am. Good-bye. God bless you." He bent and kissed her hand, while Horwich, consumed with curiosity, goggled at him. To Phoebe, long past being able to recognize what his intention must be, this speech was the last straw. She managed to say, "Certainly, you exaggerate, Duke. Good-bye," and then hurried into the house. "When the baggage has been taken off, drive back to Salford House," Sylvester told the chief postilion. "You will be paid there. I am going to walk." When Reith presently opened the door to his master, he was a good deal shocked. He had rather suspected that something was wrong, and he perceived now that something was very wrong indeed. He had seen that look on his Grace's face once before. It wouldn't do to say anything about it, but at least he could tell him something that would do him good to hear. As he helped Sylvester out of his driving coat, he said, "I didn't have the time to tell your Grace before, but—" "Reith, what the devil are you doing here?" demanded Sylvester, as though he had only just become aware of him. "Good God, you don't mean to say my mother is here?" "In her own sitting-room, your Grace, waiting for you to come home," beamed Reith, and stood the journey very well. "I'm happy to be able to assure your Grace." "I'll go to her at once," Sylvester said, walking quickly up to the great stair. She was alone, seated on one side of the fireplace. She looked up as Sylvester came in and smiled mischievously. "Mamma! Sylvester! Now I won't be scolded. You are to tell me you are delighted to find me here, if you please." "I don't have to tell you that," he said, bending over her. "But I have to have set out without me. I ought never to have written to tell you what happened. I did so because I was afraid you might hear of it from some other source. My dear, have you been so anxious?" "Not a bit. I knew you would bring him back safely, but it was a little too much to expect me to stay at chance when such stirring events were taking place in London. Now, sit down and tell me all about it. Edmund's confidences have given rise to the wildest conjectures in my mind, and that delightful boy you have brought home with you thinks that perhaps I should like to hear the story better from your lips." "My dear, who is he?" He had turned aside to pull forward a chair, and as he seated himself, the Duchess saw him for the first time in the full light of the candles burning near the chair. Like Reith, she suffered a shock. Like Reith, she recognized the look on Sylvester's face. He had worn it for many months after Harry's death, and she had prayed she might never see it again. She was obliged to clasp her hands together in her lap, so urgent was her impulse to stretch them out to him. "Thomas Ord," he replied, smiling as it seemed to her with an effort. "A nice lad, isn't he? I've invited him to stay here for as long as he cares to. His father thinks it time he acquired a town bronze." He hesitated and then said, "I dare say he may have told you, or Edmund has, that he is a friend of Miss Marlowe's, an adopted brother, as it were." "Oh, Edmund was very full of Tom and Phoebe, but how they came to be mixed up in that imbroglio I can't imagine. Phoebe seems to have been very kind to Edmund." "Most kind. It is rather a long story, mamma." "And you are tired, and would rather tell it to me presently. I won't tease you then, but tell me about Phoebe. You know I have a particular interest in her. To own the truth, it was to see her that I came to London. He looked up quickly. To see her? I don't understand, Mamma. Why should you? Well, Louisa wrote to tell me that everyone believed her to be the author of that absurd novel, and that she was having a very unhappy time, poor child. I hoped I might be able to put a stop to such nonsense, but I reached London only to discover that Lady Ingham had taken her to Paris. I can't think why she shouldn't have written to me, for she must have known I would help Verena's daughter. It's too late, he said. I could have scotched the scandal. Instead, he broke off and looked keenly at her. I can't recall. Was my busy Aunt Louisa at the Castlereagh's ball? Yes, dearest. I see. He got up jerkily and moved to the fireplace, standing with his head turned a little away from the Duchess. I'm sure she told you about that, what happened there. An unfortunate affair, said the Duchess calmly. You were naturally very angry. There was no excuse for what I did. I knew her dread of... I can see her face now. What is she like, Sylvester? She waited, and then prompted. Is she pretty? He shook his head. No, not a beauty, Mamma. When she is animated, I believe you would consider her taking. I collect from all that I have heard that she is unusual. Oh, yes, she's unusual, he said bitterly. She blurts out whatever may come into her head. She tumbles from one outrageous escapade into another. She's happier grooming horses and hobnobbing with stable hands than going to parties. She's impertinent. You daren't catch her eye for fear she should start to giggle. She hasn't any accomplishments. I never saw anyone with less dignity. She's abominable and damnably hot at hand, frank to a fault. And a darling. Should I like her, Sylvester? Said the Duchess, her eyes on his profile. I don't know, he said, a suggestion of impatience in his voice. I dare say, I hope so, but you might not. How can I possibly tell? It's of no consequence. You won't have me. He paused and then said, as though the words were wrung out of him, Oh God, Mamma, I've made such a mull of it. What am I to do?